Welcome to Recap King. In this video, we will explain Tears of the Sun. This movie tells about Lieutenant A.K. Waters, who has been assigned to lead a team of soldiers into the Nigerian jungle to rescue Dr. Lena Kendricks. When Waters and his team locate Dr. Lena, she tells them she won't leave her helpless patients to be slaughtered by rebels. The team incurs the wrath of both US and Nigerian forces when they side with Dr. Lena and attempt to march the refugees to safety. Will Lieutenant Waters accomplish the mission to save all the refugees? Let's find out in Tears of the Sun. Tears of the Sun tells about the struggle of a lieutenant named A.K. Waters and his army who must fight rebel forces in an area in Nigeria while they are on a rescue mission. The story begins when the Nigerian state is being hit by an armed conflict by a group of rebel forces, causing chaos in various places, especially in the Olingo region. These rebel forces are part of the new dictatorial regime ruling in Nigeria. The regime plans to hunt down and kill opposition leaders and local residents. Even the previous Nigerian president and his family were then killed by this cruel regime. In the Olingo conflict area, 4 volunteers from the United States work as doctors and nurses to help the local people. The doctor was named Lena Kendricks, and her 3 staff were Grace, Siobhan, and Ginny. The 4 volunteers must be rescued before the armed rebels find them and kill them. So, the United States government decided to send a rescue team led by the best military force. Eventually, Lieutenant Waters and his squad were assigned to the rescue mission. The following day, Lieutenant Waters and his army departed for the country of Nigeria. First, their helicopter landed on a large ship docked in African waters. The lieutenant and his army learned their rescue locations and determined their rescue strategy on this ship. They then transferred to a smaller plane and plunged into the open waters near the conflict area to begin their rescue mission. Long story short, Lieutenant Waters and his army arrived at the rescue site in the evening. They warily sneak into the conflict area and try to find the 4 volunteers. There, they managed to find Dr. Lena and her 3 staff. Lieutenant Waters immediately went to see Dr. Lena, who was busy with surgery on one of her patients. Lieutenant Waters explains the dangerous situation unfolding and asks Dr. Lena to come with him. After hearing Lieutenant Waters' explanation, Dr. Lena was furious and disappointed to realize that the only ones Lieutenant and his army would save were her and her staff. Dr. Lena insisted that she would stay if the locals were not saved. Since they didn't have much time, Lieutenant Waters finally agreed to Dr. Lena's request. Lieutenant Waters finally accompanied Dr. Lena and 70 local residents there. The next day, Dr. Lena, Lieutenant, and the Army, and also 70 local residents were sent to the pickup location. Meanwhile, the 3 staff of Dr. Lena chose to stay with the few remaining residents. They stayed there even though they realized that there would be a rebel who would kill them tomorrow. But the staff who were there could not leave the locals injured and in need of medical assistance. The distance traveled to get to the pickup point was far enough that the lieutenant and his troops and the entire local population had to move quickly. Lieutenant Waters and his army asked the whole population to walk faster because they didn't have much time. However, the locals felt tired and needed rest due to the long journey. The lieutenant and his army had no other choice but to wait for the locals to rest to gather strength. Moreover, some of the local residents still have to bring their babies. At the same time, rebel troops appeared from another direction. The rebel troops came from outside the region to Olingo to carry out a mass-killing operation. The lieutenant, his army, and the locals tried to be quiet and not make any sound until all the rebels had passed. They almost got noticed because a baby was crying, but they managed to survive. When Dr. Lena was off guard, she didn't notice that there was still 1 rebel member left and saw her. When the rebel was about to shoot Dr. Lena, Lieutenant Walter quickly covered the rebel's mouth and stabbed him to death so that nothing happened. After going through the crisis, they then continued their journey. On the other hand, the rebel troops had arrived in Olingo. Before killing the 3 volunteer staff and local residents there, the commander named Idris Sadiq asked where the son of the Nigerian president had escaped to the Olingo area. The local residents who were there did not know the location of the president's son, were killed immediately. The local residents who still live in Olingo, they ended their life cruelly and inhumanely. After a long journey, Lieutenant Waters, the army, Dr. Lena, and the locals arrived at the pickup point the following day. One Lieutenant Waters' army contacted headquarters via walkie-talkie to immediately dispatch a rescue helicopter. Then, the army lit a yellow smoke flare to inform the rescue team of their position. Soon, a rescue helicopter arrived. It was then that Dr. Lena realized that Lieutenant Waters had lied to her. The helicopter that came could only save the lieutenant, the army, and Dr. Lena. Dr. Lena was so angry and disappointed that she slapped Lieutenant Waters multiple times. She even spat in Lieutenant Waters' face while cursing at him. After they boarded their helicopter and headed for the safe zone, the local residents there were left in the middle of the forest without any protection. They felt sad and disappointed because the lieutenant was their only hope. After taking off and their helicopter flying through the area near the Yolingo area, the lieutenant and his entire squad could see the bodies of all the local residents who stayed in Yolingo. The 3 volunteer staff who chose to stay with all the local residents who were there died tragically because they were killed by the rebel forces inhumanely. A lot of blood was spilled everywhere, and many bodies were left lying. Hurtful of the fate of other local residents, the lieutenant finally ordered the pilot to turn the helicopter back to the previous pickup location. The locals were relieved to see the helicopter coming back to save them. The lieutenant decides to protect the remaining local residents, especially the children and the elderly. Dr. Lena then thanked the lieutenant for the decision. Lieutenant Waters then contacted Captain Bill Rhodes to send another rescue helicopter. But Captain Bill said he couldn't send another helicopter because the available fuel was very limited. Captain Bills advised the lieutenant and his army and all local residents to walk towards Cameroon, where it was a safer location. Lieutenant Waters and the local resident had no other choice but to follow the advice. Eventually, they had to go back through the woods and move towards the Cameroon border. On the other hand, the rebel troops managed to trace the location of the lieutenant and his army. They then followed the trail to find the son of the Nigerian president they had been after. They continued their search by walking through the forest passed by Lieutenant Waters and his army. On the way, Lieutenant Waters and his army came across a village that was being attacked by rebel forces. They saw the troops' horribleness in torturing, killing, and burning alive every local resident in the village. The ruthlessness of the rebel troops was simply inhumane. Seeing the cruelty, the lieutenant and his army decided to attack the rebels and save the local people in the village. But unfortunately, after all their efforts, the lieutenant and his army only managed to save one villager who was already seriously injured. Lieutenant Waters and the rest of them continued their journey toward Cameroon. On the way, one of the armies named Michael reported to Lieutenant Waters that so far, it turned out that the rebel troops had been able to track their location. Knowing this, Lieutenant Waters immediately ordered his army to check all local residents to see if there was a betrayer who purposely brought a transmitter. As Lieutenant Waters suspected, one resident carried a transmitter on his body, named Gideon. The man tried to run away, but luckily, one of the lieutenant's army managed to incapacitate the man. When the lieutenant asked why he brought the transmitter with him, he replied that he did it because there was a son of the Nigerian president in disguise among the local resident they rescued. It wasn't long before it was discovered that one local resident named Bujo was actually the son of the Nigerian president. Bujo admitted that he tried to run away from the rebels because his entire family had been killed. His father, previously Nigerian President Samuel Azuka, was brutally murdered by the rebel commander. After that, his mother and 2 younger siblings were then brutally killed by the rebel troops. After hearing all that, Lieutenant Waters finally knew why the rebel troops were targeting them so much. The badly injured Gideon was left with his transmitter. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Waters, Dr. Lena, and the rest of the army and local residents continued their journey toward Cameroon. The scene switches to the moment when the rebel troops find Gideon and his transmitter. Carelessly, they immediately took the transmitter that was on Gideon's body.
No!
However, the rebel troops were blown away by the explosion of a mine bomb that Lieutenant Waters had planted on Gideon's body. This made Commander Idris even angrier, and he wanted to kill the lieutenant. As Lieutenant Waters and his army take a rest in a river, the lieutenant realizes that the decision to save the locals was unilateral. He wanted to know if the members of his army had any objections to this mission, so he asked his army if any of them wanted to go to the safe zone first. But all of them remained with the lieutenant until the end and said that the lieutenant's decision was right. Lieutenant Waters felt relieved after hearing that answer. On the other hand, the commander of the rebel forces has contacted the help of other rebel forces in Gashanka. The rebel troops will confront the group of Lieutenant Waters and local residents, so the number of rebel troops increased. The rebel troops continued their search. The scene changed when the entire group of Lieutenant Waters and his army had arrived near Cameroon's border. Lieutenant Waters and his army were already behind the reeds to hold off the oncoming rebel force. While the other local residents left first for the Cameroonian border towards the safe zone, Dr. Lena chose to stay with Lieutenant Waters' army to provide medical assistance during the war. Not long after, the war between Lieutenant Waters' army and the rebel forces ensued. In the front row, one of the lieutenant armies was in the middle and was shot in the chest. Bombs and missiles were detonated everywhere. More rebel troops were sent. Lieutenant Waters and his army tried to fight back with limited weapons. Seeing their increasingly dominated condition, one Lieutenant Waters' army attempted to contact the Air Force to send backup from the military forces. Captain Bill immediately sent fighter jets and military assistance from their warship. One Lieutenant Waters' army unit was shot and killed, leaving 4 people, including himself and Dr. Lena. Because of being cornered, they ran and escaped towards the Cameroonian border. Meanwhile, the Air Force managed to arrive, sending military aid and launching missiles at the rebel commander and the entire rebel troops. All rebel troops were successfully paralyzed. Lieutenant Waters, Dr. Lena, and the local resident made it to the safe zone. The Nigerian president's son, Bujo, then survived with several other Nigerians. All the struggles and sacrifices made by Lieutenant Waters' army finally can be paid off. The moral that we can learn from this movie is that our humanity in this world can have a significant impact and create new hope for those around us.